Hernán Cortés betrayed his own commander, burned his ships so that no one could escape, and manipulated entire peoples to destroy one of the most powerful civilizations the world had ever seen. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can know how far it has reached. In the year 1484, in the region of Medellin, in Extremadura, Spain, a sickly and weakly built boy named Hernán Cortés was born. His family belonged to the lower nobility, that social category where you had the title but not the money, where you could boast of your lineage but not fill your stomach with it. His father, Martín Cortés de Monroy, was a nobleman without fortune. His mother, Catalina Pizarro Altamirano, came from a slightly better positioned family, but equally without great resources. Young Hernán grew up watching other nobles enjoy privileges that his family could barely imagine, and that frustration planted in him an ambition that would consume him all his life. During his childhood, Hernán was constantly ill. His parents feared he would not survive, and in those times when medicine was more superstition than science, every fever could be a death sentence. But the boy survived, and as he grew, his weak body gave way to a sturdier constitution, although he would never be especially tall or physically imposing. What he did develop was a sharp intelligence and an exceptional ability to observe. He learned to read people, to understand their motivations, to detect their weaknesses. At the age of 14, his parents sent him to Salamanca to study law. The University of Salamanca was one of Europe's most prestigious centers of knowledge, but Hernán was not made for academic life. He spent 2 years there, learning Latin and basic notions of law, but his restless spirit longed for something more than philosophical debates and ancient texts. The stories that arrived from the New World, discovered just years earlier by Christopher Columbus, ignited his imagination. Those lands promised gold, glory, and the chance to become more than a noble without fortune. In 1504, at 19 years old, Hernán Cortés decided to embark for America. His destination was La Española, the Caribbean island that served as the headquarters for the Spaniards in the New World. The journey was brutal. He spent weeks on a rat-infested ship, eating worm-filled hardtack and drinking foul water. Many passengers died during the voyage, their bodies thrown into the ocean without ceremony. But Cortés survived, finally arriving in a world completely different from the one he had known. In La Española, Cortés received an encomienda, a piece of land with indigenous people assigned to work it. This system was essentially slavery disguised as evangelization. The Spaniards argued they were saving pagan souls while working them to death in mines and plantations. Cortés administered his encomienda with cold efficiency, accumulating some wealth but never satisfied. He observed conquistadors returning from expeditions telling stories of golden cities and infinite treasures, and knew his destiny lay beyond that island. In 1511, he joined Diego Velázquez's expedition to conquer Cuba. There he proved to be not only a competent soldier, but also a shrewd politician. He earned Velázquez's trust, who appointed him mayor of Santiago de Cuba. But Cortés had not crossed the ocean just to be a colonial administrator. When news began to arrive of rich lands to the west, of a powerful civilization with magnificent cities, he knew he had found his true goal. Diego Velázquez organized expeditions to these new lands. The first, led by Francisco Hernández de Córdoba in 1517, returned with astonishing stories but also heavy losses. The second, commanded by Juan de Grijalva in 1518, confirmed the existence of an advanced and wealthy civilization. Velázquez decided to organize a third expedition, larger and more ambitious, and chose Hernán Cortés to lead it. It was a decision Velázquez would bitterly regret. Cortés accepted command and began preparing the expedition with feverish energy, investing his own fortune and indebting himself greatly to equip ships and recruit men. But as the expedition took shape, Velázquez began to suspect Cortés's true intentions. There was something in the way he accumulated power and resources that worried him. Finally, Velázquez tried to revoke Cortés's appointment, but it was already too late. In February of 1519, before the official order of dismissal arrived, Cortés set sail from Cuba with 11 ships, approximately 500 men, 13 horses, some small cannons, and a few arquebuses. Technically, he had just become a deserter, directly disobeying his superior. But Cortés had wagered everything on this move. He would either return a triumphant conqueror or not return at all. The fleet sailed toward the Yucatan Peninsula, following the routes of previous expeditions. In March, they landed on the island of Cozumel, where Cortés began to demonstrate the style that would define his entire campaign, a mixture of diplomacy, intimidation, and calculated violence. In Cozumel, the Spaniards found Geronimo de Aguilar, a Spanish castaway who had lived among the Mayas for 8 years and had learned their language. This fortuitous discovery provided Cortés with his first translator. They continued along the coast until they reached Tabasco, where they faced the Cantal Mayas in the Battle of Centla. The Spaniards won thanks to their horses and metal weapons, elements completely unknown to the indigenous people. After the victory, the Mayas offered peace tributes, including 20 enslaved women. Among them was a young woman named Malintzin, who would be known as La Malinche or Dona Marina by the Spaniards. La Malinche would completely change the course of the conquest. She spoke Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica or Aztecs, and Maya, with Aguilar translating from Maya to Spanish and La Malinche from Nahuatl to Maya. Cortés could finally communicate with the empire he intended to conquer. But La Malinche was much more than a simple translator. She was intelligent, politically astute, and understood the complex dynamics among the different Mesoamerican peoples. She became an advisor, diplomat, and eventually Cortés's lover, bearing him a son. La Malinche's role remains controversial. For some, she was a traitor who facilitated the destruction of her own civilization. For others, she was a survivor who used the only tools at her disposal to navigate a world dominated by men and violence. The truth is that without her, Cortés would never have understood the political fractures he could exploit within the Aztec Empire. In April of 1519, Cortés founded the Villa Rica de la Veracruz, establishing the first Spanish settlement on continental Mexican territory. This act had a brilliant legal purpose. By founding a city, Cortés could establish a council, a municipal government, that technically had the authority to appoint him captain general directly, without Velázquez's authorization. In this way, Cortés transformed his rebellion into a legitimate expedition, at least on paper. It was in Veracruz where Cortés executed one of the boldest psychological maneuvers in military history. Aware that many of his men, frightened by stories of the powerful empire inland, might try to return to Cuba, Cortés ordered the destruction of all ships except one, which he sent to Spain with treasures and letters explaining his actions directly to King Charles V. By eliminating the possibility of retreat, Cortés sent a clear message. The only way out was forward, toward conquest or death. Meanwhile, the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma Xocoyotzin had been receiving troubling reports. Messengers arrived at Tenochtitlan, the magnificent capital built in the middle of Lake Texcoco, describing strange men with pale skin, riding enormous creatures, carrying weapons that unleashed fire and thunder. Priests interpreted ominous omens. According to later chronicles, strange events had occurred in previous years. A comet streaked across the sky. The temple of Huitzilopochtli mysteriously burned, and Lake Texcoco stirred without apparent cause. Moctezuma, a deeply religious and superstitious man, began to wonder if these foreigners were divine manifestations. Cortés began his march toward Tenochtitlan in August of 1519. The route was not direct. Cortés knew he needed allies. Through La Malinche, he learned that the Aztec Empire was not a unified nation but a confederation of city-states under Mexican domination. Many tributary peoples deeply resented the Aztecs, who demanded burdensome tributes and captured prisoners for ritual sacrifices. Cortés saw in this resentment the opportunity he needed. His first significant stop was Tlaxcala, a confederation of lordships that had resisted Aztec domination for decades. The Tlaxcalans did not welcome the Spaniards with open arms. They fought fiercely, attacking Cortés's forces in several battles. But the Spaniards, with their horses, steel swords, and armor, had decisive advantages. After several bloody skirmishes, the Tlaxcalan leaders calculated that these powerful foreigners might be the key to finally defeating their ancestral enemies. An alliance was formed that would change the destiny of Mesoamerica. The Tlaxcalans provided thousands of warriors, supplies, and local knowledge. Cortés, for his part, promised to help them free themselves from Aztec rule. It was an alliance of mutual convenience, with both sides believing they were using the other for their own ends. In October of 1519, the combined expedition of Spaniards and Tlaxcalans arrived at Cholula, a sacred city allied with the Aztecs. What happened there remains debated. According to Cortés, he discovered a Colulan plan to massacre the Spaniards. According to other versions, the Tlaxcalans, traditional enemies of Cholula, fabricated evidence of such a conspiracy. Whatever the truth, Cortés's response was devastating. He gathered the Colulan nobles in the central courtyard and ordered a massacre. Within hours, thousands of Colulans were killed. The Cholula massacre sent a chilling message throughout Mesoamerica. To challenge Cortés meant total annihilation. Moctezuma, receiving news of the massacre, found himself in an impossible position. His empire, although vast and powerful, was built on complex political structures that depended on prestige and fear. The arrival of these foreigners, capable of defeating armies and destroying cities, threatened that balance. Some advisors urged him to attack the Spaniards while they were away from Tenochtitlan. Others suggested diplomacy. Moctezuma, paralyzed by indecision and perhaps genuine religious doubts about the nature of these visitors, chose a strategy that would prove fatal. He invited Cortés to Tenochtitlan. In November of 1519, Cortés and his army, now composed of a few hundred Spaniards but thousands of indigenous allies, arrived in the Valley of Mexico. What they saw amazed them. Lake Texcoco stretched vast before them, and in its center rose Tenochtitlan, a city of more than 200,000 people, connected to the mainland by elevated causeways. It was larger than any city the Spaniards had seen, with monumental pyramids, elaborate palaces, bustling markets, and orderly canals. Even seasoned conquistadors like Bernal Diaz del Castillo would later write that it seemed a dream, a vision taken from chivalric novels. Moctezuma received Cortés with elaborate ceremonies. The Aztec emperor, carried in an ornate palanquin, met the Spanish conqueror on one of the causeways. They exchanged gifts. Cortés received gold necklaces. Moctezuma received glass beads he took for precious stones. The Spaniards were lodged in the palace of Ashiacatl, Moctezuma's father, a huge building capable of accommodating the entire Spanish contingent. In the following days, the Spaniards explored Tenochtitlan, simultaneously marveling and terrified. They visited the Templo Mayor, where they witnessed evidence of human sacrifices that genuinely horrified them. They saw the great market of Tlatelolco, where everything imaginable was traded, from jade and quetzal feathers to slaves and cacao. But they were also aware of their vulnerability. They were in the heart of a hostile empire, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of potential warriors, connected to the mainland by only narrow causeways that could be easily cut. Cortés made a bold decision that defied all military logic: to capture the emperor. Using as a pretext an Aztec attack on Spaniards on the coast, Cortés confronted Moctezuma and convinced or forced him to move into the palace where the Spaniards were lodged. Essentially, Moctezuma became a hostage of the conquerors. For months, this surreal situation continued. Moctezuma continued to rule, giving orders and receiving tributes, but always under Spanish watch. Cortés systematically extracted gold, forcing Moctezuma to reveal treasures accumulated over generations. This tense situation lasted until the spring of 1520, when news arrived threatening all of Cortés's plans. Diego Velázquez, furious over Cortés's betrayal, had sent a punitive expedition commanded by Pánfilo de Narvaez with more than 1,000 men and orders to arrest Cortés and bring him back to Cuba in chains. Cortés faced a deadly dilemma. If he stayed in Tenochtitlan, Narvaez would attack him from behind. If he left the city, the Aztecs could rebel. He made a characteristic decision. He divided his forces. He left Pedro de Alvarado in charge in Tenochtitlan with 80 men and marched to the coast with the rest to confront Narvaez. In Sempoala, Cortés once again demonstrated his tactical genius. Instead of facing a superior army directly, he bribed Narvaez officers, appealing to their greed by showing them Aztec gold, and launched a surprise night attack during a storm. In the ensuing battle, Narvaez lost an eye and was captured. Cortés offered Narvaez's soldiers a choice: return poor to Cuba or join him to share Mexico's treasures. Most chose to join Cortés, effectively doubling his Spanish force. But while Cortés celebrated this victory on the coast, disaster unfolded in Tenochtitlan. Pedro de Alvarado, a violent and temperamental man, had ordered a massacre during the Toxcatl festival, an Aztec celebration. The reasons remain debated. Alvarado claimed he uncovered a plot. Others suggest he simply panicked at the large gathering of Aztec nobles. The Spaniards attacked unarmed celebrants in the ceremonial precinct, killing hundreds of nobles, priests, and warriors in what became known as the Massacre of the Great Temple. When Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan with his increased forces in June of 1520, he found the city in open rebellion. The Aztecs had chosen a new leader, Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother, and had raised the causeways, trapping the Spaniards in the palace. The situation was desperate. The Spaniards were besieged, without food or fresh water, constantly attacked. Cortés tried to use Moctezuma to calm the rebellion, forcing him to speak to his people from the palace roof. But the emperor had lost all authority. His own people considered him a coward and a traitor. According to Spanish chronicles, the Mexica threw stones at Moctezuma, fatally wounding him. According to indigenous sources, the Spaniards killed him when he was no longer useful. We will likely never know the full truth, but Moctezuma, the powerful emperor who once ruled millions, died as a prisoner. Cortés knew staying meant death. On the night between June 30th and July 1st of 1520, he ordered a desperate retreat. Carrying as much gold as they could, the Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies attempted to escape under the cover of darkness. But the Aztecs discovered the flight. What followed is known as the Night of Sorrows. Aztec warriors attacked from all directions, from the causeways, from canoes on the lake. The bridges over the canals had been destroyed, forcing the Spaniards to cross over corpses and abandoned baggage. Men overloaded with gold sank in the lake and drowned. Cortés himself was nearly captured several times. By the time the survivors reached firm land at Tacuba, they had lost more than 600 Spaniards and thousands of Tlaxcalan allies. Most of the Aztec treasure lay at the bottom of Lake Texcoco. According to legend, Cortés sat under a tree in Tacuba and wept for his losses. But he did not give up. With the shattered survivors, he took refuge in Tlaxcala, where his allies, surprisingly, did not abandon him. The Tlaxcalans had suffered enormous losses, but their hatred of the Aztecs outweighed their distrust of the Spaniards. During the following months, Cortés dedicated himself to rebuilding his army. He received reinforcements from Spaniards newly arrived in Veracruz. He built brigantines, small ships that could navigate Lake Texcoco, giving him naval control. He forged alliances with more city-states seeking revenge against Tenochtitlan. And meanwhile, an invisible ally worked in his favor: smallpox. The Europeans had brought diseases to which the American peoples had no immunity. Smallpox spread like uncontrollable fire throughout Mesoamerica, killing millions. In Tenochtitlan, the epidemic was devastating. Cuitlahuac, the emperor who had expelled the Spaniards, died of smallpox after ruling only 80 days. He was replaced by Cuauhtémoc, a young warrior of 25 who became the last Aztec emperor. In May of 1521, Cortés launched the final siege of Tenochtitlan. It was not a battle, but a methodical and ruthless blockade. The brigantines controlled the lake, cutting off supplies. The combined forces of Spaniards and tens of thousands of indigenous allies attacked from the causeways, advancing street by street, house by house. The Aztec defenders fought with desperate courage, but they were weakened by disease, hunger, and thirst, as the Spaniards had contaminated the freshwater supplies. The siege lasted 75 days. The accounts describe apocalyptic scenes. Corpses piled in the streets, survivors eating bark and leather, skeletal warriors defending smoking ruins. Cortés repeatedly offered terms of surrender, but Cuauhtémoc refused. The young emperor preferred total destruction over capitulation. Finally, on August 13th of 1521, Cuauhtémoc tried to escape in a canoe but was captured. Brought before Cortés, the last Aztec emperor pointed to the dagger at the conqueror's belt and said, according to chronicles, that since he had failed to defend his city, Cortés should kill him. Cortés did not do so immediately, hoping Cuauhtémoc would reveal where the imperial treasure was hidden. When Cuauhtémoc refused, he was tortured, his feet burned, but supposedly never revealed any secret. He would eventually be executed during a later expedition to Honduras, removing the last symbol of Aztec resistance. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the end of the Aztec Empire. On its ruins, the Spaniards would build Mexico City. The pyramids were demolished, their stones reused for Christian cathedrals. The codices, pictorial books containing centuries of Aztec knowledge, were burned as pagan objects. The indigenous population, devastated by disease, forced labor, and violence, collapsed catastrophically. It is estimated that the population of the Valley of Mexico fell from several million to barely a few 100,000 in the following decades. Cortés was named governor and captain general of New Spain. He received enormous encomiendas and became one of the wealthiest men in the Spanish Empire. But his relationship with the crown was always complicated. King Charles V distrusted anyone who showed the ability to conquer empires with such limited means. Cortés was eventually stripped of his political authority, although he retained his properties. He returned to Spain in 1540, seeking recognition and additional rewards. But the world had changed. New court favorites had replaced the conquistadors. Cortés, the man who had destroyed an empire, spent his last years litigating in courts over properties and privileges, mostly ignored. He died in 1547, at 62 years old, in Spain, bitter and feeling that his achievements had never been sufficiently recognized. His legacy remains deeply controversial. For the Spanish crown and traditional European historians, Cortés was a hero, a brilliant conqueror who incorporated vast territories and riches into the empire. His military tactics are still studied today as examples of how small forces can defeat empires through diplomacy, alliances, and psychology. But for the descendants of the conquered peoples, Cortés represents something very different: the beginning of a cultural and physical genocide. The conquest destroyed sophisticated civilizations that had flourished for millennia. Systems of astronomical, agricultural, and architectural knowledge were lost. Millions died from disease, slavery, and violence. La Malinche, his companion and interpreter, also remains a controversial figure. In Mexico, her name became synonymous with betrayal, and anyone who prefers foreign things over national ones is called a Malinchista. But modern historical revisions view her more nuancedly: an enslaved woman who navigated impossible power circumstances using the only tools available, and whose translations and advice were absolutely crucial to Cortés' success. The Tlaxcalans and other peoples who allied with Cortés have their own complex narrative. They were not simply passive victims nor simple traitors. They made strategic decisions based on their own political interests, seeking to free themselves from Aztec rule. They could not foresee that by helping to defeat the Aztecs, they were facilitating their own eventual subjugation under a colonial system that would be even more oppressive. The story of Hernán Cortés is not simply the story of one man, but of the brutal clash between two worlds, two systems of thought, two completely different conceptions of civilization, religion, and power. The Spaniards arrived with superior military technology, devastating diseases, and an absolute determination to impose their religion and extract riches. The Mesoamericans had sophisticated civilizations, but were politically fragmented and lacked biological immunity to European diseases. Hernán Cortés was a product of his time, a man of unlimited ambition willing to use any means necessary to achieve power and wealth. He was a brilliant strategist, master manipulator, remorseless traitor when it suited him, and directly and indirectly responsible for the death of millions. Understanding his story requires recognizing both his undeniable tactical genius and the monumental horror of his consequences, avoiding both the hagiography that turns him into a hero and the simplification that ignores the complexity of the societies he encountered and the alliances he formed. He was the man who destroyed an empire, and in that process permanently transformed the course of world history.